Kneel before me when in my presence.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. And apparently, Gil Urian today. I still think this is like they really didn't think about this costume quite the way that it might have needed to be thought about. But thankfully, the style you fight those two characters with isn't terribly different, so here we go. It looks like this might be a little laggy, but we don't know yet, so since ping bars don't always tell you too much, we're gonna go with it. We've got a zoning Urian here, which is a relatively difficult matchup for our Karine, mostly because the spacing she normally wants to stand at doesn't work well. But bulldogging is a thing that she has to get used to eventually, and Urian's honestly a better character to teach it than Guile is. One of the key parts of bulldogging is to get your opponent to tire themselves out mentally, rather than just basically throwing yourself at them and hoping they eventually fail. This is difficult for Karine because if you don't think about her moves in the right way, you'll just run into stuff. One of the better things you can do for yourself, therefore, is move a little slower most of the time, but it doesn't look like that's where we're going to be starting today. Let's see if I can think of anything to tell her to calm her down a bit. Well, the most important thing is that Urian is fairly easy to block for a long time because he can't really do anything after his second or third hit, depending on where he is. So he does have pressure, but the pressure has real gaps, unlike some other characters where you basically can't get out, and you have to V-reversal or choose your correct spacing to jump and hope for the best. Urian doesn't beat those options that easily, so you can at least do something. It's a matter of at least a little bit of patience, and in neutral it's very similar. Moving too close to him will let him use his long normals to defeat you, but moving close to him while attacking can be really helpful. And of course there's the obvious, hey, let me just neutral jump this so you can't immediately throw another projectile. It's very important thing in these games to remember your opponent can't throw another projectile while the first one is on screen, which is why we constantly tell people to just neutral jump over them. The rest is a matter of adapting to your opponent's style. This player, for example, seems to be no stranger to just EX headbutt, which is technically good because Karine is very good at punishing this move compared to most characters. But the rest is patience, and patience is always a battle. Similarly, if you find yourself being too patient, you'll often be unable to function because you are forcing yourself to be patient. So it's a thing you just have to practice overall, to become calm enough to recognize it's not time to hit a button yet, or it is time to hit a button now. An opponent who's familiar with the way a character works will usually have the capacity to find the right timing to bait you into acting, because they know approximately how long that character tends to stand still before they hit a button. And honestly, that wasn't too laggy, so we'll see what happens from the other side, assuming they stick around. Looks like they're at least going to try. So hopefully Justfine will be able to face them. Justfine's more likely to have some chance here if they play Urian again. But honestly, it depends. Their style as shown there was something one could sort of have figured out from just their main character. Or rather the main character shown. Boxer is a character that often does that sort of thing, but Bison has to be fought even slower because he can both dash through certain of Urian's projectiles with lots of warning, since Urian doesn't have the different lateral projectile speeds. He can also, if he prefers or happens to be far away, just absorb them and mostly for Urien, he'll want to hold on to them to prevent anything else. So, you see the correct and pretty much obvious choice of sticking with V skill 2 so that Bison can't just absorb every projectile and has to dash through or jump over some of them. The bigger problem comes that once Urien is at close range, Bison actually has more issues than most characters in dealing with this. He has issues keeping up charge because of the way Urien moves, and his walk speed means that repositioning after stuff can be a little difficult. But we still see that overall is working approximately as you'd expect from Just Vine's style and level of play, with some bold attacking strategies here being shown off by our guild player. Ooh, that was a good one. It didn't work out, but it was good. Our bots will help you learn to defend against Aegis setups and trickery, but there are still definitely like instant bold tricks you can do as Urien and get stuff out of it. So don't ever give up just because, oh yeah, people know how to defend Aegis. No, just do something crazier first, because you can't react to the first crazy thing immediately. It just isn't a good idea to always do that. But if you figure your opponent's defense is good, try something with shenanigans. Another good space out there, but that I think was missed. Execution. So yeah, this player has a good concept of when to throw out their shenanigans. And you get sort of interactions like that, which are cool. You can also notice that they're basically pushing each other to the limits of their meter quite often as a result of this. So this is quite good. They both have just about the right amount of understanding of rhythm and just the right amount of patience to get random things to happen, but in the good way. That jump up, for example, is a Bison thing that he doesn't normally get away with, but if you're playing against this style of player, it might be a good plan. That move is actually a little easier to dash through than you might think, but because you require the V trigger one to be active for a sure bet at it, it's a little rough to pull off sometimes. A lot of the time the reason you need to neutral jump over things is to force the opponent's next projectile, if they choose to throw one, to come at what you consider to be a time that is predictable. So it's not necessarily that you are trying to escape the move or even get in on them, but simply if they want to continue zoning, the zoning becomes a more predictable timing for you. So good outmaneuvering in most positions here. I think that was still technically the right thing to do in terms of which Devil Reverse to use. So, good flow there as well. And managed to win just as the opponent managed to get enough V trigger to become suddenly dangerous, so fortune favors the bold, I guess. And this Urien is quite bold, forcing Just Vine to also play in a relatively bold way. There's the jump out. That was probably good to go for given the low damage that Urien tends to get off of that. It is one of those things that makes using EX Head Stomp a decent option in this matchup as a whole. If you're pretty sure your opponent isn't going to punish the move for being done, then you can see what happens when you drop in on them.
Final round.
Similarly, using slide as a movement tool can definitely help you more than you'd normally expect. That is more deceptive than I thought it was, so good match overall.
Wins.
Since we went straight into it, we actually didn't get to explain that this lounge is basically Atlantic Rim. If you are somewhere close to the coast of the Atlantic Ocean and have decent internet, chances are that even the ping bars you see don't really mean anything. We do tend to keep it to a 3 to 5, but the game will let in people who aren't actually quite that. So, feel free to join us and get your own practice. Looks like we might be fighting a Super Saiyan for a while, depending on their interest in continuing such matches. You are therefore looking for 3 rounds first to 2 with character select on, and looking for Rune Siren as the player host of the lounge. We'll probably be going for about another hour, 15 minutes, maybe hour and a half, which is our standard. And mostly what we'll be talking about today is actually execution. But I had to set the scene somewhat, so I guess I'm probably going to be doing that for a little bit longer, especially since the Wolf, fortunately, literally just started training against Boxerbot again. As in, I oversaw check the inputs and so on to make sure, yeah, this is the right thing, this is acting about as good as you can get it. But that also means that the Wolf has only been able to practice against Boxerbot for like 2 days. Which means that understanding how Boxer's offense works is the thing that's going to end up being learned here. Still, it's good to have at least the base principles of how to fight the character in mind, and the bot will in fact teach you most of that. Understanding how to defend is basically up to you. But we are seeing immediately some signs of understanding how to deal with this character as a whole. Particularly with Necalli, you often need to neutral jump. With other characters you may have other ways to keep Boxer away from you, but Necalli just doesn't have these options for the most part. You pretty much have to read the timing of Boxer's attack and jump. What you can do that many other characters cannot though is take decent advantage of Boxer attacking and being blocked. This could be a good reason why we're already seeing so many overhead style attacks from Super Saiyan, because it's simply too easy for even a relatively well-spaced attack from Boxer to face off against Necalli's relatively long buttons once one understands when the block string has ended. Necalli tends to trade his way out of these situations or get relatively big damage from fairly far away. So, while the Wolf is probably not practiced enough to be throwing out those things, initial practice with Boxerbot might lead to us seeing a little more of it. See? Stuff like that. It's not that Boxer doesn't have advantage in those situations, it's that understanding what the advantage is can be a little bit tricky. Necalli has an invincible uppercut, can backdash in a lot of positions, and can neutral jump out of others. In fact, the backdash was probably the only thing missing in that sequence. The Crawling Beast is also, as just demonstrated, a really good defense against this character if Boxer decides to hang back, because the punch itself does not always hit Necalli within certain spaces of interaction between this move and the other. The other move used here also tends to be useful because Boxer has to get so close to use the KKB to go through I keep on forgetting that move's name. I just think of it as Shout of Power, sorta. But overall, you can't just retreat, so it's probably going to lead to an immediate bit of, oh, I understand why the bot is this way. So thanks to Super Saiyan PC for immediately validating our Nakali's course of training. It's definitely one of those matchups where your execution is probably going to be the thing that limits you the most. Whereas for Kareen, it's accuracy. You don't really have to have super good execution on Kareen other than the fact that, you know, you might end up low pixel health, barely trade, lose at the end sort of thing. And it does have some downsides in that Kareen doesn't have a lot of great ways out of boxer pressure other than finding the right backdash moment. So she can't usually just decide, okay, I'm going to do whatever I want. She has to backdash out of various positions because he'll just keep going otherwise. But aside from that, it's often an accuracy question. And this accuracy often matters in neutral. Not only is it accuracy in neutral, it's often somewhat like, it's not even preemptive really, it's, okay, I'm seeing this thing happen, therefore I can move now. The good thing is that most of her attacks actually just win against mid-range things that Boxer does. So, beyond that, it's just a matter of realizing, okay, I need to defend, and my opponent is going to use a lot of energy to make sure I can't defend. You have to be very calm in this matchup for that reason. You have to spend a lot of time blocking and often just hit the throw. But it is also true that the being thrown only comes up in a relatively limited number of situations. The pushback on Boxer's moves and most of the spacings that he uses to stay safe while attacking you mean that normally he can't actually just throw you. He has to telegraph it enough that you would probably be able to just tech it. But you have to be really calm, because without the calm, you have no accuracy, and without the accuracy, you basically don't have a matchup. He is relatively weak to her in footsies, but this just means that you have to be even more on point because your opponent doesn't have a good reason to play footsies. Their optimal position is always to get in close, force you to defend, or mess you up in some other way. And honestly, this is probably why I think the choice of V-Trigger 2 in this case is a really good one. Because this is the way you get a throw that actually matters. And I can't really think of what exactly Kareen does about this situation. Most of the time you have to be just so good in neutral up until that point that you never get there. You can try sometimes, depending on your opponent's movement, be reversing them off really early, but again, this is more so about feeling it out more than anything else, I'd say. Her benefit though is that once she has enough meter, particularly from winning neutral, it's a little bit harder to consistently push forward because she can just like uppercut you out of it.
You lose.
So if you wanted to think about a game plan, if you are a Kareen player that's relatively confident in your neutral, in your footsies, even if you're not that skilled, you're confident enough to feel like you understand what's happening, then stick to that and worry about the execution later. Worry about, like, is my spacing perfect? Is my accuracy perfect? Those things are still a good way to push forward and should lead to some benefit eventually if you keep on working at it. Our bot does not help with this. Our bot is meant to teach you how to defend against specific things and get out of the way. You can practice it to a point, but he spends a lot more time throwing out specials because the bot is more so meant to teach you how to fight players who are in the lower ranks and just get you used to the character. Technically, the thing one needs to understand to defeat Boxer as a character at the higher levels is better learned by fighting against our Lara bot, I believe. We have a kata for it that you can use as well. Just the idea of someone who will keep on coming forward and who you must calm yourself and choose which of your defensive options to use. Or just keep blocking because you don't think they're going to force the use of it. People have always said that this matchup favors Mika quite a lot, and in a lot of ways it does. But it also relies on two things that Mika can't necessarily always risk doing. The first is that once again she also must backdash, but now that V-Shift is available, she has some pretty strong options there because of the way her V-Shift works. Meaning that your opponent needs to have a lot more mix-ups in the throw game. This means that often you end up backdashing out of block or V-shifting out of block in ways that you don't normally do against other characters. That moment there, for example, is almost exactly what we're talking about. You end up taking the throw against this character sometimes because initial pressure on makeup requires you to block and then get out of the way. If your opponent notices that you spend too much time getting out of the way immediately, they'll just switch to something else that does different damage. One useful point though is that at this range, Mika can basically just do her mic and get away with it most of the time. So, she can also spend a lot more time in the match calling Nadeshiko, using even more V-Shift, and just wearing Boxer down. Until he eventually makes a mistake in terms of spacing and actually gets, like, grabbed. At the very highest levels, you could probably V-Shift into grab, but that only works on very specific strings that he wants to use, so don't go trying it too early. Your opponent has to demonstrate a specific thing they want to do before it's a good idea. As for when to use your mic, it's similar to the Akuma matchup. When you see your opponent either back off, or some situation that results in them having no good reason to advance, this is usually the best time to just do it. And, unlike Akuma, you can just hold it for a bit. Because dropping it just isn't required. The mic will stop nearly anything Boxer does. He just gets hit by it on the way in. He can sort of dash and then jump, but even this doesn't always work. And we saw the neutral jump there, presumably because she, even though she could have V-shifted, it was probably a little risky. Bit of rough blender there. In order to get yourself a Boxer bot that can do the overhead correctly, it is a little hard because of the speed of certain inputs required. Particularly his Action 5 and I think Action 2 are quite hard to make sure that he can do the overhead, and therefore force you to learn to defend against it. This is particularly true because of the way that wake-ups work in the game. It is very common to do wake-up things but not be absolutely sure whether or not your opponent's attack is meant to hit you or whiff and get you to have the reaction to that attack. This is why having that overhead is so very useful. If the overhead is intended to whiff time-wise and you see it and react to it and stand block, obviously you are now susceptible to crouch attacks. Similarly, if you think it's not going to happen and you therefore crouch, you will get hit by the overhead. And in both of these cases, the character has some fairly good damage they can output. I can see them as a Rashid player. It's the same sort of thing. You should expect some zoning with the tornadoes, but not too much, and some motion to get in from weird positions. I wouldn't expect a lot of dive kick, but Rashid is another character where you have to be really confident in that neutral jump, except that for Rashid, you more so do it when you're cornered. You can neutral jump out of Rashid pressure in the corner a lot for some reason. I'm still trying to figure out why this works, but I've watched it work at extremely high levels, and nearly every Rashid I've ever seen anyone fight, it works enough to make them change the way the pressure is going, which is honestly all you can do. He does need to have some of this pressure. But you'll note that this character has almost the exact same option, to do an overhead which could be timed in such a way as to be confusing. So, yeah, I can see them playing Rashid, and it's nice because this allows our team to get even more experience with different characters while still facing an opponent who is going to basically do the same thing.
Round 2.
This is one of the best ways to get experience as a whole, I think, to have someone just, yeah, I play like this, I'm going to play all the characters I can play and do this with. So you can learn all of their little tricks and idiosyncrasies while we're at it. But it's not necessarily going to have to hit a very large amount of different buttons here. Ooh, could have gotten that one. You'll notice again, you have very similar scenarios. If you're being poked low, you probably don't want to counterattack, you probably want to backdash out of it so that you can get some control of the situation yourself. Right there, for example, backdashing away from that might be better, simply because you probably have a move that you can do. Nikali's not so great. Standing there doesn't help either.
Rashid wins.
One might be tempted to counter or parry in those situations, but often your opponent will just stop using the technique altogether. After all, the only reason they're usually doing it is because it helps them keep control of the spacing. You could very easily block that heavy punch that follows those 2 light kicks every time with no benefit to them of any note, really. But them doing it creates a spacing that you can't attack from, which helps a lot. And of course, the more often they do it and the more frustrating it is to constantly be locked down, the more likely you are to try something and get hit, even though your opponent really has no reason to not just hit it basically forever. Even getting hit with an invincible move probably isn't a great deterrent at this point, especially if they're already confident that they can win. This is one of the things that high-level players use against players of lesser skill really often. The fact that they can afford to do more risky things, or even repetitive things, because there simply isn't enough total tactical risk in doing so. Plus, if you do learn to deal with it, it's probably just one in their very, very large bag of tricks, and they'll just move on to the next one. You see it perfectly as illustrated there. The light kick, heavy punch, and then you can't do anything on Nikali. You just basically stand there. Rashid, on the other hand, has a lot of options at that space. So your best bet would be to get out of that space simply so that Rashid doesn't have those options. Now, different characters have different ways of getting out of the space and different things they can do afterward. But due to the way that Rashid's moves work in particular, he doesn't really have a way to catch you for doing this. If it does happen, the damage is usually quite small and very risky for Rashid to actually do in the case where you didn't backdash.
It's go time.
But it looks like they've headed on out for now. So one big burst of data for later, and we go back to within team battle.
Let's do this. Kanzuki. Nekali. Tsuyuki. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! You win! Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
Final round. Fight! You lose. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! You lose. Let's do this. Round one. Round two. Fight! Bison wins. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Bison wins. Let's do this.
OmniRabbit joins us today for reasons related to the theme of the stream, execution, and specifically things like, oh, I'm using this controller now, or change my controller in some way. Fighting game players go through controllers pretty fast. Some part of the D-pad is always wearing out in some direction for some reason, because that's just manufacturing. Some part of the internals will always be slightly weaker. In this case, the right D-pad on the controller being used for Station 1 is in fact slightly off. But it's often that way that happens when you tap it and when you don't tap it very hard, so there's not much going on yet. It's just something you'll notice occasionally, which is obviously still important. The important thing is not necessarily whether or not it's actually working, but what, if any, adaptation you can do for yourself based on the fact that it's less effective. Mostly, when it's at the early stages like this of being worn down, the only thing you really care about is not getting stressed when it fails you. You wouldn't want to take it into the tournaments if you had such things, but this is, as usual, practice, and therefore sometimes it just won't work quite right and you'll have to think about it. This can definitely affect your blocking though, so at least trying to make sure that you are on the right side of the screen if you can, to lessen the stress of that, can be a thing you can actually put into your strategy. But it does depend on the players. Most of the time though it comes down to just a back throw versus not, and hopefully playing toward the center of the screen so that you don't put yourself in a situation where the corner play is causing you to have problems. This match looks a little laggy. And of course that makes tacking throws a little harder. Ooh, well spaced there.
Final round. Fight.
Korean players' mid-range defense often reminds me of someone who plays a lot of Guile. Because you can base certain forms of mid-range defense on, I'm just gonna block because I know you're going to come for me, and I have superior buttons so you can't enter my space unless I let you. When you're facing that sort of character, especially on characters like Bison, you tend to have trouble because you'll end up telegraphing anything you use to get raw advantage. Often you must use things like EX moves just to get in, and then you might get uppercut, you might get thrown, you might get reversal, and so on. From the defensive Korean perspective, there's not a lot you can do about that as Bison, particularly because of the walk speed available to the character.
Round one.
One decent option because of her relatively poor anti-airs is various Devil Reverse shenanigans, but this isn't always enough by itself. One thing it does help with is preventing her from doing certain styles of attack though. So if you find that the player is one who eventually becomes aggressive, you might be able to get something out of just Devil Reversing in weird situations. The other main thing that works is she'll eventually put herself in a space where she can be reversaled, which then helps you get enough space to do Devil Reverse things. But there's no easy way out of that. Because even if the Bison attempts to dash out of certain stuff, she may just have a chase ready, and she does get to keep on doing damage from those. well-spaced double reverses are basically free. She can counter them, but it's not easy enough to be a good plan. And you see the benefit of being able to use that as a main tactic is that you spend a lot more time doing back heavy punch stuff and baiting Kareen rather than the other way around.
Final round.
This mostly comes up because she wants to stay at a space where you have to enter her territory, let's say. But if you set up the double reverse timings and head stomps right, then she can't be sure whether or not you're going to do those, whether or not you're going to do slide even. And you can keep up your advantage for pretty long this way, because you've changed the opponent from being confident in your position to being kind of stressed out by you being at the very spot that they're used to being good. From the Kareen side, your best option is usually to use more Mujinkaku and not think too hard about the fact that you've lost control of neutral. Because it isn't really that you've lost control of neutral, you've lost a specific spot that you were using before. This works on Sakura as well. Sakura deals with the situation more so by just hitting heavy punch, which goes straight out in front of her and helps quite a lot. But Kareen doesn't actually have a button that is the equivalent of that, not even Mayokin. So she has to put up with a lot more of Bison's movement, let's say. She can jump more, and it does help because the opponent then has to think about whether or not she's going to jump. And on top of everything else going on, might not be ready for them all the time. The problem is that Kareen isn't terribly good at managing to get the throw after the jump, so she can often be V-reversal in those situations. I wouldn't necessarily suggest V-shifting, but the V-reversal often helps, since she doesn't have a so-called zoning jump of her own. And even if she did, it would just get countered by Psycho Burst, honestly. You can see that the spacing is somewhat gets a little convoluted here as a result of this. One good option is to just move out of the way altogether, giving Bison a harder time simply because of Kareen's great walk speed can really shift this flow, but Bison players tend to be a lot more aware about what's going to happen after their head stomp than any player they're attacking because they're the one in control of it. There is a good jump though, and enough for a finish probably. No, actually not. Oh! But once again, execution. One of the deep sadnesses is that if you practice long enough, you'll wear out the very controller that you need to get good with. And this is why people use arcade sticks, which wear out differently, and at least you can usually tell exactly what's happening. But sometimes that's just not your thing. And they're off.
Let's do this.
Be on guard.
Lara.
Let me zap you.
Those of you who are familiar with arcade sticks can possibly guess why OmniRabbit is joining us today, and therefore what the title of the stream has to do with the theme.
Boom! That's how you start the fight and finish it quickly.
Different ways of holding the actual arcade stick for those who don't use hitbox, and different specific tops for that stick actually apparently affect people quite a lot. And therefore, our Lara is trying out a different top on the stick today. The last bit of information was, hey, this is working pretty good. But at the end of the day, execution is a very heavily adaptive skill in the mind, so you have to be placed under stress to know whether or not it's working. Now, the amount of stress you need to be placed under can vary. Often Nashbot is good enough. I'm just gonna autopilot the same way I always do, and being able to turn off your mind to a certain extent and then autopilot allows you to watch for what has changed, spend your time noticing instead of trying too hard. But fighting familiar teammates or friends can have very similar effects, especially if you are pretty confident in the matchup and it's not somehow disadvantaged to you. Lara doesn't have a lot of really disadvantaged matchups, at least not within the team, so it'll be pretty easy for OmniRabbit to get some of this experience, especially since the way in which other players are stressful often require the very things that the bat top or ball top test is meant to check. We're talking, can I finish this combo, can I do this out of this situation, etc. One of the things that is highly important and honestly quite annoying is to drop a punish. But if your opponents mostly play super safe and don't really do much that would be punishable, then you're often playing a very slow, methodical game rather than having to think about that. And then when you do, you can't really tell if the reason you dropped the punish is because your timing was off, or because your stress in some way, execution, controller finally breaking down, etc. Similarly, getting a new controller is always difficult because it almost always changes your timing in some way, even if only a little bit.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
OmniRabbit very carefully using the negative space here. But Cammy's walk speed is always going to throw that off just a little bit if she decides to walk. Not necessarily a lot more, just specific spots where it's just, okay, I'm going to back off a tiny bit to change the spacing from what you expect, and then make my attack. So that sort of thing happens. It is possible to learn interactions between characters more so by timing than by spacing, and if you find yourself constantly getting hit by a player who is higher level than you, in ways you never expected to get hit normally, that's almost always the reason. They'll take a single step back in the time where a different opponent would normally just block and therefore not move, change the spacing without you noticing, and you still hit your button at the same time, but the spacing is wrong. It takes a long time to be able to pick up on that consistently though, but that's what makes pros pros in nearly every such game.
Let's do this.
Boom! That's how you start the fight and finish it quickly.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight! Bison wins. Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight!
Let's see what you've got. Keep on.
KO!
Wait.
And Bison wins. Let's do this. Round 1.
Interestingly, Bison can't do what Kareem normally does in this matchup because Bison's jump is too long. He will often go entirely over Necalli's head, and this happens at a lot of levels. Fortunately, he also has just Psycho Burst, which will usually put Necalli in a bad position by itself and force the Necalli player, if they intend to jump after any interaction, straight into the normal range that Bison can actually anti-air. Jumping forward in other situations tends to lead to the same problem. You just get hit by Psycho Burst and that's it. So, the spacing that Bison often ends up at makes it harder for Necalli to do an actual chase down, and tends to keep Bison out of the range of any overhead style attacks. There are in fact lots of gaps in Nakali's strings where different strengths of Psycho Burst will just solve the problem. And he doesn't do a terribly good job jumping over them either. So, understanding when you should try to keep charge and in what ways, specifically what buttons should you hit in order to mask the fact that you're trying to do this, comes up a lot. In order to defeat it, Nakali often has to hit a lot more buttons, and those often open him up to being parried or bat-dashed away from. The bat-dash doesn't necessarily help on its own, but parries and V-reversals do offer some measure of defense. In fact, the more buttonsy the Nakali player tends to be, the more likely it is that you will benefit from hitting the parry, simply because hitting anything else won't usually work either, so you might as well. But at the right spacing, standing attacks hit, whereas Nakali's crouching attacks just don't, and therefore Bison gets a fair amount of control in the matchup. You can see from there, Nakali reacting to the parry in the right way is, I'm not even sure it's completely possible per se. He can obviously do something, but it's not like a big deal that he has all these great options there. Because Bison's parry doesn't really look like a parry that you can easily punish. One thing we've mentioned many times before is that no matter how long a parry actually seems, unless the animation is a big tell that you can just see easily and go, oh, okay, it's parry time, most of the time you're just reading it. This of course then gives Bison a lot of V-meter for a lot of V-reversals. And Nakali's pressure strings, if we can call them that, don't often put him in a good enough position to defeat or bait a V-reversal in any meaningful way, especially since Bison doesn't extend himself forward to do his V-reversal pretty much at all. What makes this matchup kind of hard is simply that it's hard to get damage while using this particular strategy. So your combos have to be on point, and that brings us right again back to execution. Is it good enough? Is it going to get us through this match in the specific way that we were planning on it or not? Playing it out slowly can be kind of a pain. Still, it's enough of a strategy that unless the Nakali player has a lot of output or a lot of specific type of planning skill in the mid-range, and I do mean planning skill, Bison can normally hold this position well enough to keep control of a matchup. You also see there the use of the heavy kick, which is a pretty good counterpart to the parry, simply because it clashes so well. So you can think about it, adding it to your play at least a little bit is less scary as you do it more and more, even though it would seem as if it should be more scary because your opponent will, you know, do something else. The fact that, as usual, making them even have to think about doing something else is kind of the point. On the Necalli side, interestingly, this has a really easy solution most of the time. You just need to light kick and dash forward and throw more. Mainly because the light kick isn't likely to reach, and the dash forward throw can also be a dash forward block, which deals well with Bison just doing parry things in neutral. Mainly because Bison does a little bit worse than Necalli at extremely close range in the matchup. They're both somewhat relying on pushing the other out of range to cause trouble in some way. But Necalli benefits so much more from being close just because Bison's tools are limited that, yeah, just going, okay, my block string's over, I should probably just sit here for a moment and then maybe dash. Now, obviously you can't just always dash, just as you can't just always hit buttons. But if you were losing because you were hitting too many buttons, often you can dash. This is even more true once Necalli is in the trigger, because no matter how good most people are at reacting to dashes, the point is that Necalli's V-trigger makes him better straight up. So being able to get closer before your opponent can tell that that's what he's going for is enough stress. Bison also having a very long jump and kind of floaty even on the neutral jump with no instant overhead to speak of means it's a little bit easier for Necalli to control things as a whole. With this particular choice of V-skill, and technically I think it's not that different even if he uses the other one, it's much harder to build up the actual V-trigger, but it's a good way to finish things off when you've taken a lot of damage because the match is slow and relatively neutral based. Bison can also use somewhat offensive V-reversal situations once he's gotten himself into the right spacing, but Necalli often gets out of this in various ways, or just uppercuts, so I wouldn't necessarily suggest going for it as a holistic thing.
Necalli wins.
Always remember that simply by making your opponent think about one more move, you have forced their hand from, okay, I'm concentrating on when you do something, changed to, I'm concentrating on both which thing you do and when you do it. Which according to most psychological studies is at least a 6-frame difference in how quickly you can actually deal with the problem. Which is why people tell you, you know, just guess. Because at least then, you won't be handicapping yourself on both fronts. Opponents who are really good at stressing people will get them to the point of not being able to react to anything in time. Which is, you know, terrible.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight! You lose. Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! You lose. Let's do this.
Boom! That's how you start the fight and finish it quickly.
Round one.
Got you! Ding ding!
Round 2. Fight!
Let's see what you got, man. Right there.
KO! Lara wins. Round 1. Fight!
Stand up. And let's see what you got. That was so close.
Round 2. Fight! Lara wins. Let's do this. Round one.
Alright then, we are getting close to the end of the stream. This goes into a very longer, intense match, which it is likely to do honestly. This may be the last on-stream set of the night. These two know each other's spacings really well, so it tends to be a protracted experience. Really well. So it looks like we may be in the market for yet another controller.
Round two. Fight.
But don't worry, all of the ones we've currently got move on to new homes in new games, because there's always some game out there that doesn't need a specific button all that much. Analog stick giving trouble? Probably still works for fighting games. D-pad giving trouble? Probably still works for some game that nearly never touches that. Issues with buttons being sticky in some way? Turn off the button in some game where you never use it, or, in even more interesting cases, just play some RPG with it where it really doesn't matter timing-wise. As long as it's not getting stuck when you try... It's getting stuck in repeating inputs when you try to press it. That particular controller, because you know it really can't be used for much anymore.
And Bison win.
That said, the stream is ending mostly because there's not necessarily a lot more to say. The topic of execution isn't really something that you can give any specific advice to any given person on if you don't use the same input device they do. And by that I'd sometimes mean literally, hey, did you test with this controller that I'm having trouble with to tell me if something's up here? If you are a very serious or even relatively serious fighting gamer, you're probably going to end up keeping your equipment up to date in that specific way. But at the end of the day, not everyone can afford that. You'd say that arcades used to help out with this, but not really. They just used to be broken themselves, and then whoever ended up on the broken side was at the disadvantage. Sure, it was always in the best interest of the arcade owner to fix this. After all, who's going to put in a quarter on the side that they know sucks when the better player is already on the other side? But, you know, old rules of etiquette. You can definitely be, like, ready for these things yourself in various ways. Understanding, yes, my controller can't last forever, and watching for specific things that happen to it. But regardless of how you deal with the problem, your actual skill and execution is going to shift whenever you get your new controller too. So be gentle to yourself in that time when you're making the transition from one to the other, as it can be a long process. That said, it's usually a positive thing after a couple of days. The human brain is remarkably good at just refactoring small little things like, okay, well, this is how hard I used to press this before, now I shouldn't press it that hard, so yeah, we're just updated now. Some people's brains can do that literally within the space of an hour or two. Of course, you don't want to have to do it. You want every advantage possible when you're playing seriously. So it's best to get your initial practice with stuff in this way. Grab your friends, grab your teammates. Or, if you have no good connection to anyone because the internet can be itself in various places in the world, we will always suggest probably at least one bot you can manage to input to at least do a check on whether or not your stuff is going to keep working. Those bots mentioned can of course be found at our website 2-mk.org, and as of now, there is at least one bot for every Street Fighter V character available under the SFV-bots, or just bots, since those were the originals. Last week we had Tuesday Absolver content, but it was mostly just spacing practice. This week we might have something more involved, but it's hard to say because time is always difficult when it comes to those specific things, and Absolver is a little wonky sometimes. There's a mild chance of Melty Blood content on Wednesday, but we're not expecting to be back to DOA on Thursday. Other Melty content, specifically CL bot, probably, might be something you get to see on Friday upcoming. But so far we've been missing our Fridays more often than I would like, so I'm not necessarily willing to guarantee any of it. But that brings us to the end of our stream for tonight.
Laura wins.
You can join the lounge at any point. People will probably still be hanging around for another at least 30 minutes, but this has been really in 14 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.